So, a little while ago, I published a video showing the power of the Xbox Series X running in backwards compatibility mode using Xbox One X titles, where we could test some of the most demanding console games unleashed with the power of AMD's Zen 2 CPU architecture and 12 teraflops of GPU compute. But since then, Microsoft's preview program has released more games, with all of them due to be signed off by the time you receive your consoles. So in this video, I'll be looking at more of those games, showing off the good and, well, the not so good. Not so good, well, maybe that's an exaggeration. What I really mean is no real change from the experience as it already is on existing Xbox One X consoles. But yes, Xbox Series X backwards compatibility still often has the power to surprise, and yes, this is Ark Survival Evolved, running on a console for the first time at 60 frames per second, albeit in lower quality mode with a very low native rendering resolution. Higher detail mode? Yeah, not even the backwards compatibility power of Series X can get the job done there. But there is clearly a huge improvement over the existing Xboxes. I mean, Ark is one of the least optimal games we've experienced on Xbox One. Big improvements from Series X then, straight off the bat, but I think on the flip side it's worth repeating once again that the more optimal the original experience, the closer the developers got to their performance targets, the less improvement you'll see on Xbox Series X. Case in point, Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that's had a large amount of requests for coverage, and yeah, you see, the thing is, Rockstar did a great job originally on this one. It runs at native 4K on Xbox One X. There is no dynamic resolution scaling, and it hits its performance targets really well, with only minor dips. Series X obviously improves on that, but curiously it's still not perfect as we traverse our old Saint Denis benchmark. What you do get is extra texture filtering quality, but man, wouldn't Microsoft's 2x frame rate technology go down a storm on this one? Then again, we may simply see Rockstar release a remastered version of the game. I also think there are other limitations in play on Back-Compat titles that you need to be aware of. Sometimes the original games had performance caps in place that can't be shaken off without intervention from Microsoft or the original developer. So here's Batman Return to Arkham. Well, the Arkham City portion of the game, the 30 FPS frame rate cap can't be moved, so improvements over the original game running on Xbox One X are going to be minimal to non-existent. Again, the best you can hope for here would be enhanced texture filtering and, of course, auto HDR. Now, things go from a tad lackluster to downright bizarre when you look at Return to Arkham's Arkham Asylum Remaster, which still, bafflingly, runs at 45 frames per second locked, meaning constant judder from start to finish. Series X can only give you a better lock to 45 frames per second. It can't remove that lock. You can't get 60 frames per second. More's the pity. But as I mentioned in my first video, where games have unlocked frame rate options, or indeed truly terrible performance to begin with, you can see some absolutely transformative experiences with Xbox Series X. So this one is interesting because Just Cause 3, well, it's legendary, right? I had the chance to talk to Square Enix's studio tech director back in the day when I looked at Just Cause 4, and he told me that the crucial physics code in Just Cause 3 used just 2 cores, resulting in this truly terrible performance. Jaguar just couldn't keep up. And actually what you're seeing here is Xbox One X dipping beneath 20 frames per second. And remember, One X had the fastest Jaguar implementation of all of the current gen consoles. Not surprisingly though, Xbox Series X can run this game all day at its target 30 frames per second, no matter how insane the action. In fact, it could likely lock to 60 frames per second if that was actually an option. Now, this title never received Xbox One X support, which means that the experience is, and likely always be, 900p, short of a Microsoft intervention, of course. But I guess what that does mean is that if you see this game running on Xbox Series S, it's likely going to look exactly the same to what you're seeing here. So yes, one of the most CPU-bound games on Xbox One finally runs at its original performance target. Think of it as an early Christmas miracle, if you like, but more to the point. I've got to say, the game is really great, and I think now you can appreciate what it offers without the genuinely awful performance getting in the way. Now, I really hope that the PlayStation 4 version is similarly improved, when it runs on PlayStation 5. It should be exactly the same as what you're seeing here, just with the original native 1080p base resolution from the original PS4 game. Now here's the thing, there are other, different forms of enhancement too, things I didn't really cover in the last video. Okay, so I talked about how games with dynamic resolution scaling can improve image quality on Xbox Series X. I showed Modern Warfare 2019 running with improved performance, no screen tearing on the new machine, but there's something extra here that I'd like to highlight. If you look closely at the buildings there, you'll see that there's less in the way of horizontal scaling. Series X is resolving more detail. Nice stuff, but here's another, perhaps more dramatic example. So Ninja Theory's Hellblade has a 60 frames per second mode, and as you can see here with our performance readouts, it's running locked at 60 frames per second on both machines. But if we look closer, image clarity on Series X is far, far superior. Now you might be waiting for the pixel counts here, but this one is extremely difficult to get a lock on. And to be honest, we're swiftly reaching the point where resolution as a metric doesn't really matter. We need a different way of looking at this. Somehow we need a way of measuring clarity, something we've been puzzling over a fair bit here at Digital Foundry over many months now. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to reiterate what I said before. Games with unlocked frame rate options really are the bee's knees for Series X, especially if you have the choice of resolution options too. And I think the vanishing of Ethan Carter kind of stumbled onto something rather special here, in that there are 1080p, 1440p and 2160p options in the menu. Plus you can toggle the frame rate cap on and off at all of those resolutions. Let's look at Xbox One X first in 1080p and 2160p modes. 1080p, as you might expect, no problem sustaining 60 frames per second for the most part, but clearly 2160p is too much. I think back in the day, 1440p turned out to be a good middle ground. Interestingly though, at 1080p you can see that at some points the game is CPU limited. There are pockets of performance dips which by a process of elimination can only be CPU based in nature. 4K modes, like for like, One X versus Series X, and yet now we have a full 4K 60 experience without CPU or GPU bottlenecks. So I think the astronauts never built Ethan Carter specifically to scale beyond Xbox One X, but due to those options it just does. And now I do have to wonder whether having performance options built into console games to future-proof them to a certain degree may now be a good thing, even if it's not particularly performant on current generation hardware. Now I talked in the first video about transformative experiences, and here's another one. The Evil Within 2. A brilliant game, but it's similar to Dead or Alive 6 that I covered in my first backwards compatibility video. I'm pretty sure that for the most part here we are GPU limited, and this is the kind of frame rate graph I love. Almost parallel lines with a good chunk of space between them. Series X doesn't quite lock to 60 frames per second, so we do have an interesting benchmark scenario here, and if we switch the graphing to percentage differentials, the gap between One X and Series X ranges from around 70% of extra performance on the new console all the way up to a remarkable 2 times multiplier in frame rate. Pretty awesome scaling there, I think, but it's not a uniform performance boost from title to title, which brings us on to the baffling mystery that is Assetto Corsa Competizione, which, well, I'm not really sure where to begin on this one. On the one hand, since Tom first looked at the game, the option has been added to unlock the frame rate, which is obviously a good thing, especially when we're testing on a next generation console. Having played it on One X, I'm not sure it adds much to the experience. It still feels really janky, but being unlocked, Series X obviously can do a ton better, as you can see. Again, it's rare that you hit 60 frames per second. And yeah, moving into percentage differential territory, our gains now seem to range from about 44 to 65%. I've got to admit, I'm kind of baffled by why this game runs as it does on Xbox One X, but to see the combined power of Zen 2 and 12 TFLOPs of GPU power produce just this level of improvement, well, I'm not sure I can actually process that. I guess at least we have another Series X title to add to the growing list of games that I want to try with variable refresh rate support. So I'm going to end the analysis here with something rather interesting, a game that you can run with VSync totally disabled, which in turn completely removes the frame rate cap. And I think this may well be the only title for Xbox One that does this. But Rainbow Six Siege in its single player modes basically allows you to remove that frame rate cap completely. And if you set your console to 120 Hz output, you do actually see all of those frames properly rendered, albeit with eye-searing screen tear. Now that's not pretty, but this is going to be the closest thing we'll get to a PC-style benchmark. And as you can see, the game actually renders its own frame rate counter, which I've added into the composite split screen feed here. Now I would love to use our frame rate analysis tools here if I could. Now I can track the tearing and thus get a proper frame rate reading on One X, but on Series X performance actually exceeds 120 frames per second, which means that our tools can't track the performance profile with full accuracy. So yeah, no in-depth graphing for this one, but when we freeze frame very similar scenes, I detect around 80 to 90% of additional performance moving from One X to Series X. Really interesting stuff, I'd say. So I think that's basically about as much as I can say about backwards compatibility right now without having access to the full library. There's still no access to Wolfenstein, the new Colossus for example, but I fully expect that to lock at 4K 60 based on the equivalent results I've seen from games with a very similar performance profile. I'm also really keen on checking out Crysis Remastered because I suspect that the performance modes there are entirely CPU bound, and as we've seen in both Just Cause 3 and Assassin's Creed Unity, well, CPU no longer seems to be any kind of bottleneck with Xbox Series X. I also really want to check out Star Wars Republic Commando on OG Xbox, which, not even Xbox One X can render that fully at a locked 60 frames per second. But anyway, I think there's something really interesting to take away from all of this testing. You see, I love the fact that Xbox is getting improved versions of so many games right out of the box. Xbox One X often delivered the best multi-platform experience, but sometimes gunning for native 4K resolution came at the expense of performance. So, an interesting example here. I think Modern Warfare 2019 is as good an example of this as any. Xbox One X looked better than PlayStation 4 Pro, but the Pro flat out ran better at a lower resolution. So at that point, I'd prefer to play on the Sony machine. But Series X just powers through to deliver the definitive experience, on console at least. And I honestly think that with the arrival of the enhanced machines, we've seen this last generation get a time extension in a way. Games generally still look awesome, but now they're running better on Xbox Series X, often transformatively so. The flip side to the equation is titles like Just Cause 3 that came out just too early for Xbox One X, and therefore we're left with 900p resolution and no performance modes to unlock the frame rate for the most part. Throwing all of that extra horsepower at low resolutions isn't ideal. I'd say that's the main problem facing Xbox Series S really. It doesn't have access to Xbox One X performance profiles, meaning those enhancements, those higher resolutions, those higher frame rates are locked out. Now hopefully the Microsoft compatibility team can step in here. Anyway, we'll be looking at more backwards compatibility as and when, but it's likely to be on Series S or on new titles that catch our eye. But that's all from me for now. Please do like and subscribe to support our work, and of course, ring the bell for instant notifications when a new video hits the channel or when we kick off a live stream. The Digital Foundry Patreon, as ever, stands ready to serve you with pristine quality video downloads of everything we do. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, and just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.